Hey guys, welcome back to my channel once again. Kenroy here. This week I'll be covering something which affects so many people around the UK and I'm sure around the world in fact. This week's video guys is all about what a leaseholder is and also what a leaseholder entitlement is all about. So I'll be covering a few important points which hopefully will be able to give you a better insight as to what you're getting yourself into if you were to buy a property that actually have a lease. Now, as always, the information that I'm giving you is for advice, as they are, companies out there and professional bodies which are able to give you more accurate advice, to point you in the right direction. Now, I highly recommend that you check out the L.A.S, which is the Lease Advisory Service, for more information to things that are pertaining to your specific circumstance. Now, I'm not going to pretend for any stretch that I'm an expert in this area, and a lot of the information that I'm sharing, I've used different resources in order to get that information. So I will be checking my computer screen as I go along in order to, give you the information. So please do your own due diligence, especially when you're thinking about buying your own property, especially if that property is a flat, as there's a lot of information that you need to get through to make sure that it's the right decision for you. Now, if this is your first time stopping by my channel, I want to say a huge thank you, for stopping by. And please feel free to check out my previous videos. I'll put a link to my previous videos just above, so check those out if you want some more interesting content on property. Now, my channel is all about property investing, personal finance, as well as some DIY along the way. And I hope that as I share my experiences, it will be able to help you to make more better decisions for your future. So what is a leaseholder? That's the first question that we need to answer. Now, a leaseholder is basically when you buy a property, the property itself may belong to you, but this property only belongs to you for a period of time. Now, the reason for this is that the land that that property is on more than likely belongs to the developer. So I'll give you a prime example of this. Now, a prime example of this would be where I'm currently situated right now, this plot of land that I am on. If I was to own this piece of land and I wanted to develop it and put some apartments, some flats on this property, I could very well do so. Now, even though I might develop on this site and put a number of flats in, say, a 3-story building, I could then go on to sell those flats to individuals with a lease period to which they will own that property, say for a period of 150 years. Now, once that 150 years, for example, is over, if they did not extend the lease on that property, I could actually take that property back as it was leased to that individual for that period of time. So this in a nutshell is what leasing is all about. Though you own the property, you do not own the land that the property is built on. So this is something that you have to consider when buying a property that is leasehold. Now, of course, there's a difference between a leasehold and a freehold property. Now, I'll probably do a separate video on that in the near future. Now, a freehold property is a property that you not only just own the building, but you also own the land that that property is on. So from start to finish, once you've purchased that property, it will belong to you and nobody will be able to evict you from that property after a number of years. So a leasehold property essentially means that you only own the property for a fixed amount of time. So this basically means that you'll have a legal agreement with the landlord, which is also known as the freeholder. So the person who owns the land is the freeholder, to which you are the leaseholder. So you're leasing that property and that land. Essentially, it's like you're renting it from that individual for a set number of years. And of course, this is where we get the term lease from. Now, your lease will tell you how many years you actually own the property for. So it's important for you to know this before buying a property. Now, once that lease period runs down, the ownership of that property now is transferred back to the freeholder. So this is something you have to also consider. Now, most flats are leasehold and houses, of course, can also be leasehold too. And these are usually bought through a shared ownership scheme, for example. Now, the next thing that I'm going to touch on is the leaseholder's rights and responsibilities. Now, your lease will actually tell you some of the responsibilities that you actually have as a leaseholder. So it's important to always check the fine print. Information such as whether or not you'll be able to make any changes or alterations to the actual property will be in your lease. Other things such as, how much you'll actually pay for maintenance of that individual property. Other things that may be included are whether or not your landlord will be the one responsible for repairs to the property. So it's important to check this out first. Now, other things to consider are things such as service charges and other expenses. Now, your lease will set out the way in which your service charge is organized, as well as what you'll actually be getting for that service. Now, if you pay your service charge, you'll have the right to do things such as ask for a summary showing, the charges and how it's all worked out. You'll also have the right to request from your landlord, things such as receipts for things which have been repaired after you've paid your service charge each year. Now, like the name suggests, your service charge is a fee which will vary depending on your borrower and where you are and what type of property it is. Oftentimes you can either pay monthly or you can pay quarterly or even yearly. But your service charge is something that most lease properties will have to pay. Now, the next thing that you have to consider is ground rent, and this is something that's normally standard. Now, after doing some research, I found that you may not even need to pay ground rent unless it's been stipulated in your lease. Now, obviously, if your lease says that you don't have to pay a ground rent, then you probably won't have to. However, if your landlord then decides to change that and demand that you pay ground rent, you will have to comply with that. Something else to consider is that your landlord can actually increase the amount you actually pay for your ground rent as well. Now, another important expense to consider when it comes to leasehold properties is building insurance. Now, your landlord will usually be responsible for your building insurance, but you have to once again check your lease to see what that actually covers. Now, in many cases, this normally covers the entirety of the extremity of your property. So for example, if you're in a tower block of flats, the landlord will be paying that building insurance. But realistically, the landlord isn't paying the building insurance. You're the one that's paying it through your service charge. They'll then deduct a portion of that to actually pay overall insurance for the entirety of that property. Now, one thing to bear in mind, as a lot of people later find out, this doesn't always include internal fixtures and fittings, and as well as personal content. So you have to make sure that you get a separate insurance for your personal content. But again, you'll find information about this in your lease. Now, moving on from this, we'll be talking about extending and ending your lease. Now, this is something that so many people are interested in for obvious reason. You don't want your lease to run all the way down because if you do so, you could risk losing the property. Now, you can ask your landlord to extend your lease at any time, which is really a good thing based on the laws that we currently have here in the country. You might be able to extend your lease by 90 years if you're in a flat, depending on what you qualify for, or 50 years if you're in a house. Again, this will vary. The L.S.A or the Lease Advisory Service does have a calculator which will give you a rough amount at least of to how much you will actually pay for a lease. Now, I'm not going to go into the figures as to how much it actually costs for you to increase your lease, the length of term on your lease. One thing through doing the research that I have found out, however, is that you want to make sure that you increase your lease before it runs down to 90 years. Now, you're probably thinking to yourself, but 90 years is a long time. I might not even live to see the age of 90. So why would I want to spend the money? And of course, there is a cost to increase the lease. The simple reason behind this is that a lot of the lenders and banks, they almost penalize you, or a lot of lenders don't want to lend or give a mortgage on a property that is below, say, 80 or 90 years. So the sooner you can increase that lease, the better that property can hold its value. The banks and the lenders will have more reassurance knowing that the landlord of that property won't be coming by to take that property back from you anytime soon. So as a rule, 90 years, you shouldn't let your lease run down past 90 years. Now, another factor to consider with extending your lease before it reaches 90 years is the fact that the lower you allow your lease to run down is the more expensive it will be to actually increase your lease. Now, I'll put a link below in the description with a calculator, hopefully, showing you how much it will actually be for you to extend your lease from, say, 50 years to, 150 years versus from 90 years to 150 years. The numbers are significant. We're talking about a couple thousand versus 30, 40 or 50,000, guys. So do take that into consideration. And the last thing on this is that the lower your lease on a property is the less value that property will actually have. So please, whatever you do, don't leave it till last minute. Always extend it as soon as you hit around 90 years. Now, in regards to changing your lease, you can actually negotiate certain changes to the lease. Sometimes this is known as varying the lease. So you have to first obviously speak to your landlord about this. And if you can't agree, you might be able to apply to a tribunal or contact the L.A.S. in order to get some advice on how to negotiate extending or changing certain aspects of your lease. So when it comes to ending the lease, if it runs all the way down to zero for whatever reason, it's actually very rare for a landlord to end the lease and evict the actual tenant. There are some circumstances and leases that let them do this, sometimes known as a forfeiture proceedings. However, they need to send you a formal and a written notice to get the court's permission before they can actually kick you out. So you are protected by law after living in that property for so many years. They can't just kick you out just like that. There's a formal process to go through. Now, you can normally end the lease with, say, 1 month's notice, but once again, the L.A.S. can give you more information on this. Now, this is something that I found very, very interesting and quite surprising, that when your lease actually runs down to zero, you don't actually have to leave the property. Because you're a leaseholder, which basically means that you're a tenant, and the person who owns the lease, the freeholder, is technically your landlord, you are still in the same relationship, although your lease has now run down to zero, which basically means that you can carry on with the same arrangement until the freeholder decides to change that. Now, if you have a really good freeholder, they might not want to kick you out. If the tenancy has come to an end, you can actually carry on as if nothing has actually happened. Now, obviously, I don't know why you would want to be in a situation like that, but that is the information that is available if your lease actually runs down to zero. Now, the next point I want to touch on is buying the freehold for your property. Now, all you need to do is simply ask the landlord to sell you the freehold for that property. Now, there are different legal requirements depending on whether you're buying the freehold for a flat or a house. Now, for example, if you're buying a flat, you might need to buy a share of the freehold for that property. However, if you're actually buying a house, you may have the right already to buy the freehold for that property. Now, there's also something called a right to refusal. Now, this is when the landlord is trying to sell the freehold for the property that you currently live in. This is usually flats, but what they have to actually do is offer you, the leaseholder, the first choice in actually buying the freehold. So, for example, if I was living in a flat and it was a leasehold property, if the landlord wanted to sell the freehold, he would first have to offer me as a leaseholder the right to buy the freehold for the property that I own before offering it to others. So I would basically then have to refuse that before he can sell it on to somebody else. That way, there won't be a changing of management without my consent. Now, this leads nicely into the rights of managing your property as well as managing disputes in your freehold property. Now, this is something that I wasn't aware of, but you're actually able to change the management of your entire building if you're unhappy with how the way things are being run as a leaseholder in that property. Now, there are a few things that you can do. You can either ask a tribunal to appoint a new manager. You can also take over the management responsibility yourself, which is known as the right to manage. Another thing that you're able to do as a leaseholder is also appoint a new manager. Now, you need to provide evidence, and you need to prove that there's been bad management from your current manager before you can actually get this done. Now, things that they'll look at for bad management is that you'll be forced to pay unreasonable service charges, and I'm sure many people will testify to that. Another thing is whether or not the landlord has complied with the approved code of conduct in terms of management practices. You can apply to the tribunal in England. I know it may be different in Wales and other parts of the UK. Once you've got a case for poor management, you then need to apply to the tribunal for them to look over the case, and hopefully you'll be able to change management. But it's important to know that you can only apply to the tribunal if you've given the landlord notice. In other words, you've told them that their service has been, substandard and you need it to be improved. Now, if you give them a section 22 notice, it will give them a chance to actually fix the issues, which may mean that you might not actually need to change management. So this is the process that you need to change management of your leasehold property. But it's important to know that, you don't have to suffer in silence. You can actually do something about it. Now, another thing that goes hand in hand with this is the right to manage. And this basically lets you, along with other leaseholders in your property, in your flat, for example, take over the management of certain management responsibilities from the landlord without actually proving that they have been a bad landlord to begin with, or bad managers. Now, you and the leaseholder can actually manage this yourselves, but obviously you need to contact the L.A.S and see whether or not you qualify for this before you can get the go-ahead to actually manage different services in, whether it's a block of flats or a masonette, whatever the situation is. Now, we're nearly there, guys. The final thing that I'm going to be talking about is managing disputes as a leaseholder. Now, a lot of leaseholders sort of suffer in silence because, there's multiple people living in a block of flats, for example, and, they try their best to manage whatever disputes they may have. Now, hopefully this will be able to shed a little light on how you can actually manage this process. Now, you can actually have a mediation service. If you and your landlord come to any sort of disagreement, this mediation service may actually help you to fix that, whatever disputes that you might actually have. Now, it's important to know that this can also come with a fee, this mediation service, so do bear that in mind. Also, all the advice, once again, can be found on the L.A.S website. Some of the things that you might run into and disagreements as a leaseholder that you may find issues with your landlord, with the freeholder, are things such as the cost of the service charges, what you're actually paying for. Perhaps you're not getting the adequate amount of service for what you're actually paying. Extending your lease, as I've mentioned, buying the freehold, applying to a tribunal. You can apply to a tribunal if you have a dispute with your landlord. For example, if there's services such as administrative charges, which, a lot of them are big on a lot of admin costs. The cost of building insurance, are you paying more than you should if you were to get it independently? Appointment of a manager, and of course things that I've mentioned such as the right to manage, or if they've breached the lease in any way, shape or form. So these are things that you can actually get help with, in terms of managing any dispute. And it's great that the law actually backs you up. Now, I've never gone through these processes personally, and no doubt it's going to be a tricky and, a laborious process. But it's actually good to know that you can actually do this and challenge the freeholder if there's any dispute that you have in regards to your lease. So there you go, guys. I hope that this information was beneficial to you. Like I said, it's a lot to take in. However, there's some really good information there. Now, I put the link in the description below, guys, for you to check out the website, the L.A.S in particular, because they have a lot of information on there. Now, hopefully you'll be able to speak with someone if some of the things that I've mentioned in this video, is pertaining to your current circumstance. Now, like I said, leasehold properties are something that a lot of people try to stay away from. I myself did exactly that a few years ago before buying our home. But I do understand that there is a need for leasehold properties here in the UK, because let's just face it, we're limited on space. Land is a premium. Now, a lot of people obviously don't want to get rid of their asset and their investment. However, they want to provide a service while making an income by building properties and leasing them to people who need places to live. So, I'm not totally against it. However, me personally, I do think that is a lot of investment needed as a leaseholder to keep a property that almost doesn't feel like it's yours, so I know it's very difficult to get your head around, but it's definitely a necessity in the current climate that we're living in. Once again, guys, if you find this video useful and informative, and if it's benefited you in some way, please smash that like button, and of course don't forget to subscribe. What are you waiting for? I try and do weekly videos like this, guys, to give you the information that you need in order to make better informed decisions. Perhaps you know somebody that could benefit from this video. Of course, don't hesitate to share it on your socials and share it with somebody so that they too can benefit. My question of the day is, are you a leaseholder? What are some of the advantages that you've had from buying a lease property? or perhaps you're somebody who is considering it. What are you actually thinking about in terms of buying this lease property? Do you think it's a good idea? Please comment down below, guys. I want to hear from you and let me know. Like I always say, your comments are not just there to give me feedback, but also others that are watching this video can learn something that perhaps I haven't even covered in this video. And I always respond to all the comments, so please don't hesitate to give me a shout out down below. Once again, I want to say a huge thank you for stopping by. I hope this video has been beneficial to you. This is Kenroy saying, I'll see you when you see me. Take care.